Hello everybody, I'm Nguyễn Thanh Hùng from the School of Information and Communication.
Nói to lên đi.
Nói to lên hả?
Vâng, nói to lên.
Okay. Hello everybody. I am Nguyễn Thanh Hùng. I'm from the School of Information and Communication Technology. Today I will give a lecture on the version control. So this is the outline of this course. First, I will give you an introduction on the version control. Then is the set of vocabulary that you need to know in order to understand and in order to get familiar with the version control models and tools. Then the third session will be on the version control models, in which I will present the mechanism using in the model control. And finally, I will give several popular tools so that you can choose one of them to use in your working team. So why we need version control? So let's imagine some situation. The first situation will be that your program is working, and then you just change that one thing, that one small thing, and then your program breaks, and then you don't know why, and you want to change it back to the version, to the moment that it was still working, but your program is still broken, and then you don't know why, because you don't remember what you have a change and what broke your program. And I think this already happened to you, to developer, several times. And another situation will be like your program worked well enough yesterday, and then you want to you made some changes. You made a lot of improvements last night, but it is not done, and then you have to make a demo on your program. It means that you need a running version of your program. So you don't know what to do because you have not finished your improvement yet, and you have to do a demo right now. And I think this also happened to some of you. The next scenario is very popular one, that you change one part of your program, so it's still working, and your co-worker change another part, it still works good side, but then you put them together and it doesn't work, and then you don't know why. You don't know from which modification that breaks your program so that it is not working anymore, and then you want to see that. So where the members in your team have changed in your program. You want to know the source, the location of the things of the change that broke your program, but it's not easy. And another one, that you make a number of improvements to a class, and your co-worker also make some different improvements to the same class, and then you don't know how to merge them together because you have a single class, single file, and both of you make modification on the same class. It's not easy to merge them, to merge the modification together. So that's why we need version control system. It's very important and especially necessary nowadays in for working team with more than one developer. And so what is version control systems? A version control system, we can call them is a source code control system does that things. It can keep multiple versions of everything, not just the source code. It can keep also, for example, the log files, the documentations, images, and other kind of files, so that you can look back, you can get back to the previous a previous version at any time. And also it can request comment regarding every change. So it very helpful. For example, when you look up when you look at the modification last week, and you will see that why you make this modification. You will see that so what you had finished with this modification with your comment. It allows also to check in and check out a file, so you know which file someone else is working on. So you see it's very useful. So now, before going into the detail, into the models, into the mechanisms of version control system, let's get familiar with some vocabulary, some commands that we often use in a version control system. So the first one, we call it the repository. So, or actually it is a source control repository, and which is a server that stores all the files, including the code, the documents, the media files, etc. And it can keep a change log so that you can look back to any modification with the comments at any time. Another vocabulary here we often use, which is a revision or version, and it is individual version or state of a document that is a result of multiple changes. And then we have the notion of checkout clone. When you do a checkout or you do a clone, it means that you want to have a working copy of the file from a remote repository into your machine, into your local directory. We have the notion of change, which is a modification to a local file that is under the version control. Because, okay, you can have a set of files, some of them are under the version control and some of them are not. And the change is a modification to a local file under version control. You have the change set or change list, which is a set of changes to multiple files that are going to be committed at the same time. And then you have notion of commit or check-in. So every time you want to make some changes from the local repository, you want to commit it, to submit the change from the local working copy to the repository. And every time you do a commit or check-in, it will create automatically a new version. And of course, when you working with more than one developer, even you already have some good mechanism to control them, you still have conflict, which actually is simultaneous change to a certain file by multiple users. But most of the version control tools, they provide some methods to automatically solve the problem, and you also can solve them manually. We have the update, get latest version, fetch, and pull. It means that you want to download the latest version of the files from the repository to a local working directory. So every time you want to get the files up to date, you always have to fetch or to pull from the remote repository into the local storage. And you can do the undo checkout or revert or undo changes every time you have a mistake and you want to undo it. And then you have the notion of merge, which is often used by the developers to combine the changes to a file which is already changed locally and simultaneously in the repository. And it can be automated in most cases, except if it has conflicts, then you have to solve the conflict before merge them together. And then you have label and tag to mark which the name of group of files in a given version. For example, when you do a release, you can tag them as a version 1.0 release. So I hope that you already get familiar with some vocabulary which is often used in the version control tools. Then we will see how it works, which is the mechanism being used in the current tools now. Let's go to the models. So here for versioning models, we have three models here. We have the first one, which is the lock, modify, unlock. Second is copy, modify, merge. And the third one is the distributed version control, which is very popular now. The first one, let's go to centralized version control. So the idea of this is that you have only one centralized repository. So every developer who want to work with this repository, they will commit and update directly from this repository. For example, here we have 3 working copy, and every time they do commit or update, they will do it directly with the centralized repository in this case. But of course, the centralized is not a good idea because you might have conflict. You might block each other because of the modifications you have made. And then we have the distributed version control. The idea of this is that each developer, so we have a centralized remote repository, but each developer, they also have a local repository. And then every commit, every update, they do first with the local repository. When everything okay, they will push the modification into the centralized repository. This will make sure that if somebody hasn't finished anything, or they might have something that can cause a bug, then it's not they will not push it immediately into the centralized repository. Everything should be controlled, should be managed, and should be checked first in the local repository before being pushed into the remote repository. And this is an example of the lock, modify, unlock model. So let's look at the figure. Here we have a repository A. So first, both Andy and Bobby, they do the checkout to get the code, to get the project into the working space. And then Andy, he wants to modify the file A, and of course he wants that while he is modifying the file A, Bobby should not do any modification on the same file. And then Andy locks file A and begins modifying it. And then of course when Bobby wants to get a copy of file A, she has to wait. And then when Andy finishes with the file A, he will commit the file to the remote repository. And then Bobby can get the version, the updated version of the file A, and then we lock it in order to start some modification with the file A. And then she will commit it. And then Andy will update the file A with all the modification made by Bobby and Andy. And both of them will check out to get the version, the latest version of the file A. So okay, so a big problem of this is that each of them has to they block each other. So for example, while Andy modifying a file, Bobby cannot do anything with the same file. So you see, if Andy takes like quite long time to make modification with the file A, then Bobby has to wait and do nothing during this time. So that is one of the biggest problem of the lock modify unlock model.
Alo, anh đừng chống tay vào bàn, nhìn nó hơi ấy. Anh cứ thả lỏng người ra cho thoải mái.
Thế nên đứng như nào?
Tức là anh
Tay này hả? À ok. Không nói sớm. Okay, so let's go to the second model, which is a copy modifying merge, which is already a small improvement compared to the previous method. So here, similarly, we have a repository with the file A, and both Andy and Bobby check out first to get the file to the local working. And then each of them can do the modification on the local working. And then when they finish, Bobby will commit the file first to the remote repository. And then Andy also want to commit, but the problem here, because his local working copy doesn't have the modification of the made by Bobby, so that's why he cannot commit. So what he needs to do here is he has to first update the file with modification made by Bobby first. Then he will merge his modification with the Bobby modification, and then he will commit the file into the repository. And the file in the repository now, it contains both the modification of Andy and Bobby without conflict. And then Bobby will update. And then Bobby will update the current file from the remote repository. So also the problem of this is that they always have to pull and to push to update from the centralized repository. And sometimes with many people working on the same, it can cause some problem that quite difficult to manage and to control. So let's go to the third model, which is very widely being used nowadays, the distributed version control. And let's take an example. Here we have the remote repository, a server, and they have the file A. So first, Andy and Bobby, they have to clone the remote repository first into the local repository. So here is distributed because we don't have only one centralized remote repository. Actually, in each local working space of each developer, they already have a local repository. And then Andy can make some changes, can commit it locally. Bobby also can make some changes and commit it locally. And then Andy will push the modification from the local repository into the remote repository. Bobby also want to do the same thing, but the problem that the local repository of Bobby now doesn't contain the modification made by Andy. So that it means that it has some conflict here. So first, the Bobby has to solve the conflict before being able to push the modification into the remote repository. So what she needs to do here is to pull or to fetch and merge the modification made by Andy from the remote repository into her local repository now. And after solving all the conflict, now Bobby can push the her modification without conflict into the remote repository. And then Andy can pull from the remote repository into the local repository. Now both Andy and Bobby have the updated version with all the modification made by Andy and Bobby. So this model can solve many problems, that they can work independently. At the same time, they don't block to each other, and it's not easy to make conflict, to have conflict on the remote repository, which is very important. So now more or less I already talked about the three models. So the first one, the second one, and the third one, you can see what is the advantages and disadvantages of each model. And most of the version controls tools now, they use distributed version control. So okay, let's go to the tools to see what we have today. We have, first is Git. Git is a distributed source control system. It works with both local and remote repositories. And it's free, it's open source. You can have Windows version, Linux and Mac version at this address. For the project hosting size, you can have GitHub. It's one of the most popular project hosting site for version control. It's free for open source projects, but for private projects, users have to pay. And we have Google Code, but actually Google Code it has been removed for quite a long time. We also have Force source control with SVN and Git. Free own projects are public and open source. We have Codeplex and we have Bitbucket. Bitbucket is quite popular source control, and it allows a private project with free user too. So okay, I already finished my lecture about the version control. So there are three main things that I really want to give to the students. The first one, that you should understand the basic concepts and why we really need a version control in the development team, and you should really get familiar with the version control in order to avoid all the conflicts you might have during your development process. Then I also give you some vocabulary. Actually, it corresponds to the comments.
Alo. Máy sao không lên hình anh kìa? Anh xem lại mà.
Tại vì anh bị thiếu cái slide cuối. Thank you.
Thế thì cứ kệ, xong rồi lúc sau anh ghép vào sau nhá, hay như nào?
Thế anh cứ để cái màn hình này cho thay sau nhá.
Vâng. Sợ rồi. Anh nói lại cái chỗ ban nãy em vừa chèn ngang vào nhé.
Okay. So there are three things that I really want to provide to the students. The first one, you should understand why we really need a version control tool during the development process in order to avoid all the conflicts, all the problems you might have. The second one, I give you some basic vocabulary. Actually, they correspond to the command in the version control tools. The third one, I give some mechanism, because when you understand how it works, you can use it more efficiently, and you can avoid the problems. And the last part, I give some project hosting sites for the version control, and most of them are free for user to use. So for the students, I think it's not difficult to register and to use one of them for the project. So thank you very much.